cases largely. First, that this creates deterrence. Second, that their regulation model works out. And third, that smaller states have the sovereignty to defend themselves. First, this creates deterrence. The problem is that on our side, conflict exists because we have very shitty leaders. Well, they don't cease to exist on your side unless and until you can prove to me significantly as to how you intend to vote out Trump. I don't think that you can go ahead and probably implement this model because these problems exist also with coordinating with leaders on your side. I think the problem again then is that they go ahead and propose this treaty counter model. What are treaties? Treaties are non-binding by nature, which means that larger states like the US, and the US actually does this, by the way, they refuse to inherently go ahead and probably sign these treaties, etc. Right? I don't want to get into this kind of responses because note that this house would motion, which means that I'm going to be charitable enough and say that if we have fiat, sure, they can go ahead and use their counter fiat. My problem then is that the kind of coordination that this regulation can bring. Note that inherently regulation efforts have been so uncoordinated in nature because of how the refusal of states to go ahead and probably coordinate in the first place, right? This happened when there was dissolution in the International Space Station, where the US opted out of regulations. But more importantly, during military regulations, escalations, countries find a way to go ahead and justify why this military escalation took place in the first place, right? Which means that they can go ahead and justify massive acts of violence, which states intend to do so, or put it as an act of self-defense without giving a justification of why they escalated to the scale of violence. Countries have done this when they did this in the state of Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, etc. These countries are much more powerful and also control the resources towards the space. I'm naming the USA here, which means that if this asymmetry exists in space access, it goes ahead and probably proves that when this regulation is put into picture or is put into place, the access or the kind of negotiation power that people have within this regulation being implemented is not going to be as effective. But more importantly, it will take much more resource because you have to hold conferences every year. Probably have to have a similar system that you have to the SDGs, etc., where you have to probably now give carbon crediting, etc., or something like that, right? With that as with not having a bargaining chip or either a leverage as a smaller nation, we think that you're not likely going to be benefited from this regulation in the first place. So they don't fulfill the one benefit that they can provide to the only stakeholder that they care about, which is smaller states. What are the two extensions that I have? First, that militarization of space creates a scale of violence that posits a harm only to be solved by a ban. Second, militarization of space recreates a permanent space race. First, why does space matter uniquely under the first extension of violence? Modern military systems already rely heavily on things that are orbital in nature. These are GPS-guided missiles. This is drone coordination. This is probably satellite reconnaissance, right? All of this means that the more space becomes militarized, the more states build systems optimized for technologically efficient violence. But also note that this has led to a precedence, which is that it has lowered the threshold required for you to opt into violence. When such technology was absent or inherently not safe to use, states opted into first negotiations and signing treaties, etc., or something like that, or thinking about first escalating into wars and knowing that there's a huge civilian sacrifice that they have to go through in order for them to enter a war or escalate with the country in the first place with troops on the ground, etc., right? Which means that when this lower threshold was there, generals inherently had to be accountable as to why they put troops in places. And more importantly, when this larger community of people who of veterans or people who have lost people in war, etc., will have this call out against governments because of the unfair deployment or unfair acts of troops on the ground, etc., right? Which means that this threshold is higher to justify and more difficult to justify to the people. Now, example of this on the comparative would be that when you had the 9/11 war on terror, the United States increasingly relied on things like, drone strikes and GPS-guided munitions, right? These were done along countries that inherently did not even know how to launch a satellite. This looks like Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia. Now, these strikes appear to be less harmful towards easily answerable towards citizens because it did not involve a lot of civilian sacrifice, right? So governments were more willing to authorize them repeatedly. Now, what happened was that it does not reduce violence, but more importantly, it just normalized extrajudicial killings because these precision strikes were not precise in nature. Something that Joseph explains to you, that when you can't differentiate between civilian infrastructure and when you can't differentiate between between just to coordinate and the millions of human lives that are on the ground, you get Gaza, you get Iran, you get like Somalia all over again, right? Because note that they cannot solve space militarization, which massively deepens because orbital systems want to make warfare more and more remote, right? They want to make warfare faster, they want to make warfare cheaper, and they want to make it less costly in terms of accountability towards the people, right? What happens then is that the vulnerable states suffer the most because the benefits of militarized space are concentrated among a handful of powerful states, right? These are probably like US, China, and Russia. Now they have superiority in terms of surveillance and global military reach, but weaker states cannot do that because they inherit vulnerability without some capacity to defend themselves. On their side, they're yet to prove how they gain this capacity, right? Before I prove that this makes every sphere of life totalize into warfare, I'll take a POI. 3, 2, 1. Cool. How did this make every sphere of life totalize into warfare? Note that war was constrained by geography and logistics before these things were inherently put into picture, and technology played a bigger role in war. Note that you had like cyberspaces and airships for civilian uses before they were militarized. This militarization now will not affect just these meager resources as it did earlier, but inherently it can now underpin things like banking, things like internet infrastructure, things like shipping and emergency response and communication systems, right? Now this conflict now can scale towards things like hospitals, civilian communications, and financial systems, right? All because you have increasingly allowed the escalation of development of military technology that uses like resources in space, right? Which is why the threshold that you have in order to prevent ban is why what justifies this ban in the first place, right? Because it removes frictionless remote warfare, which means that now you have to engage in actual like confrontation for you to inherently then decrease the threshold of opting into war. But also you can now preserve civilian infrastructure, which is why this ban works out, right? Lastly then, it creates a permanent space race, which is the last extension. Note that once a state militarizes orbital systems, other countries have to compete, right? One, they don't have the capacity to do so, but this is massively dangerous because other countries like US, China, and Russia, who have a bigger advantage in terms of how they have inherited like developed space technology for a long amount of time, have either smaller states who depend on them, but also it can divert scientific investment in public resources that smaller states have because they want to prioritize their protection, because this creates an environment of fear. The impact is simple. Now this scientific frontier that could help humanity just becomes an act of race and aggression, which has long-term consequences in the world. More on WIP, but for all those reasons, vote for government.